Okay, hopefully you've just watched the presentation regarding the Bona FlexiSand. What we're going to do now is to look a little deeper at the machine and in particular the different heads and attachments that we have for the machine. And we're going to see those used in a practical setting where we're going to refinish this pre-finished section of flooring using some of the tools that I'm going to show you now. We're going to begin with the Power Drive Connect, which is this gear-driven drive board for the FlexiSand 1.9, and as the plate rotates, the gears connect with the gear ring within the machine and drive these heads, looking at a speed of about 800 RPM, so they're going at high speed. We have the tower support, which gives extra reinforcement to the plate. So this is a tool which we can use for really aggressive processes. The heads themselves take the different types of heads with a click connector, and they lock in place simply but securely. So to begin with, we're going to use the sanding discs. We're going to sand the floor back to bare wood and go through stages of abrasive grit sizes, and following that we're going to stain the floor. But I first want to just mention some of these other attachments that fit onto the Power Drive Connect. So we have wire brushes. These can be used for introducing a nice texture to timber floors, and we'll see a demonstration of this later on. We also have the resilient brushes, which we saw in the earlier demonstration, which we used on textured resilient flooring in order to abrade and clean the surface effectively. The most recent attachment is the Ergo Edge plate, which is a wider diameter disc, and we'll be using this for edge sanding, and we'll show you this again later. One thing that's worth mentioning is that before we attach abrasives to the sanding discs, we've got a choice of interface pads depending on the flooring that we're treating. So in this case, we've got a floor that is completely flat. We've got no height variations between adjacent pieces of wood. It's very flat indeed. So for that, I'm going to use this sponge interface pad. This allows a really even distribution of weight over the sanding surface and gives us an excellent result because of that. But in some cases, we'll be sanding floors where there is a slight texture, perhaps from natural movement of the wood, perhaps due to moisture damage in the past. So in order to correct these undulations, we can use the new steel plates, and these fit onto the sanding heads, and then we can attach our abrasive onto this surface. With this rigid plate, we get a much more aggressive sand, and it's going to take out these height variations, these slight undulations which may exist with the floor. So a very useful tool. And another feature that we have, new product, these fiber pads. And like the wire brushes, these are exist to introduce some texture to the floor, but at a much more subtle level, just to give a nice rustic feel. And we'll be using those later also. So we're going to do most of the sanding to the floor using the Power Drive Connect with the sanding discs, using a sequence of abrasive grit sizes. And then for the final sand of the floor, we're going to use a different drive board, and this is the Quattro plate. Unlike the Power Drive Connect, this isn't gear driven. So we're getting a much lower speed action as the plate rotates on the machine. So it's a much milder, less aggressive sand, perfect for the final finishing. And also perfect for final finishing, especially prior to using a coloured oil. We'll be using the Diamond Abrasives Grit 120, a perfect finishing tool. Okay, starting off with the Power Drive Connect, we're going to be using the 150mm diameter ceramic 50 grit discs. I'm using the interface pad, as I mentioned earlier, so that will give some nice, a nice even pressure. And with the 50 grit ceramic abrasives, these are intended just to take the surface back to bare wood. It's a very aggressive material, and it's also very long lasting. So this is perfect when we're sanding some of these tough ceramic reinforced pre-finished products. Ceramic abrasives are the best way to take the surface back to bare wood. So taking care to mount them centrally on the sanding discs, and then we can put the plate onto the machine. Make sure the clip's in, and we're ready to start. As you can see, I've got the extra weight fitted onto the machine. In this case, because I'm using the Power Drive Connect, which is a considerably heavier drive board than the standard Power Drive plates, one weight is always going to be enough. Of course, bear in mind, the more you increase the weight, this can potentially increase the depth of scratches that are caused by the abrasives. So that's something that we need to bear in mind. The more weight we apply, the deeper the scratches, and then sometimes we have to pay more attention to remove those scratches. We're now ready to begin the aggressive sand to take it back to bare wood. Okay, the initial 50 grit ceramic abrasive has taken all of the finish off. We're back to the bare wood. I've used the Superflex hand sander just to take off the few bits that I couldn't reach because of the plastic protecting the edges. So yeah, that was handy. No need for the surfaces of an edge sander at this point, but just the odd bit I've managed to take out with the Superflex. So the next sand we're going to do is with the 60 grit abrasive, and this time rather than the ceramic material, we're using the blue zirconia mix abrasive. So we've got a mixture of two different abrasive grits, an abrasive specifically designed for sanding wood floors. What's useful here in this context, where we're going to subsequently stain the floor rather, is that the 60 grit is quite close in size to the 50, so this is going to be really effective at taking out those early scratches from the aggressive coarse sand. So I'll fit those and continue with the next sand. Time for the next sand. So this time we're going to be using the 100 grit abrasive. Again, I'm using the blue zirconia mix abrasive. Just to mention an alternative approach, which is equally valid, is to use our green abrasives. These are completely ceramic, and they're like the zirconia mix one, made up with two different qualities of abrasive. And the rationale behind this is to try and soften the scratching potential of the abrasive. So really, with all these finer grit sizes, the 100 and then the 120 that will follow, they're really serving to take out the scratches from those coarse earlier sands. So we want to limit the scratching that these abrasives cause. So like I say, we can either use the green ceramic for this, but I'm going to continue using the zirconia mix. And for the final sand with the Power Drive Connect, we're going to be using the 120 grit zirconia mix abrasives. Okay, so the surface is nice and smooth, but in order to take out those last final scratches, we're going to be now using the Quattro plate with the 120 grit diamond abrasives. So these are the perfect finishing tool. So I'm going to change this, take off the Power Drive Connect, and put on the ungeared Quattro plate. So again, this is much slower, it's much more mild in terms of the way that it's sanding the floor, and this should give us a nice uniform scratch-free surface. A further distinction we have when we're using the Quattro plate is that we no longer use the FlexiSand with the handle upright. So without the use of the geared system, the FlexiSand reverts to a standard buffing machine in the way that you use it. So this means having the handle lowered to the typical working position of a standard torque-driven buffer. Okay, so ordinarily this would be the final process that we've just completed with the 120 grit diamonds on the Quattro. However, I thought that because we've got such a flat surface and we're going to oil it later on, I thought we might try and introduce just a small amount of texture just to give it some character. So in order to do this, I'm going to replace the Quattro plates with the Power Drive Connect again. And then I'm going to fit the new fibre discs onto the plate. I've taken off the interface pad. These pads are quite thick, they're very durable, and these are intended for fine sanding of timber. But like I say, on many timber species it will introduce a slight texture, on pine in particular. Perhaps less so on oak, but I'm just hoping for a small amount of character, like I said. So that, again, these are Velcro backed, so they fit very securely onto the Power Drive Connect, and we're ready to go. Following the use of the fibre pads, we've gone from a glass smooth surface now to one that's got this quite subtle texture, and just by running my thumbnail across this particular stave I can quite clearly feel the slight texture. So given that subtle amount of character that we intended to. Before we continue, I want to get the surface now as clean as possible, and vacuuming would be the typical approach. However, I thought I'd use the new Tampico brush, a much more effective way of cleaning the surface of dust residue, particularly when you've created this slight texture. So as you can see, it's just a simple single disc with these bristles on, and we can take off the power drive connect plate. And again, with the Tampico brush in place, we'll now use the buffer as a standard torque-driven machine, so with the handle lowered. Make sure I switch the vacuum on, and away we go. With the surface nicely sanded, textured, it's nice and clean now. Before introducing the craft oil that I'm going to use to stain the floor, I want to achieve a really nice dark colour with the application of the oil. So in order to do this, I'm going to water pop the surface, which is essentially just introducing some water so it soaks into the top layer of the timber, and as it does this, it's going to raise the grain a little, give us a small amount of texture, and this will allow more of the stain, the coloured oil, to penetrate, and will give us that nice rich colour that we're after. Obviously, with a process like this, because the colour difference is going to be really quite dramatic compared to the unwater popped timber, it's important that we don't miss any areas at all. Just to give you some indication of how clean the surface is after the Tampico brush, there's virtually no dust at all on this. In fact, I can't see any. Once we've completed the water popping, it's really important then that the surface is allowed to dry thoroughly. Good recommendation is to allow it to dry overnight, and then you're absolutely certain that it's completely dry. One of the potential problems, if there's residual moisture in the timber, is it will affect the drying of the craft oil. So really important that we ensure that it's completely dry. Okay, with the floor perfectly dry now, we're ready to apply the Craft Oil 2K. One of the many benefits of this oil product is the ease of application, but also the flexibility we have with regard to the method of application. Now, this is a useful property because although with the floor we have here today, there's no gaps whatsoever, the surface is very uniform, there's not a problem with applying the oil using just a red pad with the centre removed. Pour the oil into the centre of the pad and then apply it in this method. If though on the other hand we've got floors with lots of gaps, say parquet floors or floorboards, we want to avoid the oil going down these gaps. So one way that we can do this is to put a cloth underneath the red pad and then pour the oil in. This is going to apply the oil a lot less generously, so we're not going to have lots of liquid ingressing in these areas where it's able to. Another method that we could use is a trowel application, where we just pour a small pool of product on the floor and then distribute it evenly with a trowel. We could even apply it with a cloth, with a brush. It's really not critical. The key aspects of the application of the Craft Oil 2K is to make sure that we get it onto the whole surface, leave it for a moment, but we don't want it to dry on the surface, and then we buff the excess off while it's still wet. So that's the process that we're going to use today. And like I say, we're going to apply it simply with a red pad on the FlexiSand. And first I just need to mix up the Craft Oil 2K. Obviously a 2-component product. We have this tin of hardness separate in the case of the 400ml size, but this is also available as a 1 1/4 litre size pack. Typical coverage is about 30 square meters per litre of product. So a little of this goes a very long way. So with the hardener added, it's important that we give it a good stir to mix the hardener in uniformly, but also bear in mind that some of the Craft Oil colours do have a lot of pigment which can settle out somewhat. So it's really important that we make a bit of an effort to make sure that any pigment that's at the bottom is evenly distributed too. With the hardener added, we've got at least 4 hours to apply the mixed product. So it's a comfortable length of time to be able to use the amount that we've mixed. And we're ready to go. If we find that we're running out of oil, it's a very simple matter. Just applying a little bit more to the pad and we can continue. Of course, ordinarily, I wouldn't have the luxury of having a floor which doesn't have any borders, so we would have those areas to do. This can be done very simply, just with a rag, with a cloth, with a brush. It's really not too critical. So we can do the edges separately. It makes no difference. We're not going to get any overlap lines. We're not going to get any varying intensity of the colour, so it's a really safe system to use. So like I said, we would leave this a few moments just for the oil to penetrate, and then we can begin buffing off all the excess. Now this is a really important aspect because we need the stain in the timber, not sitting on the surface as a coating. And once we've done that, we can leave it to dry. So we can begin that process now. So I'm just going to put Nice clean oilcloth onto the floor, tap the edges over. This will be held in place by the weight of the machine. It's important to get the pad on centrally, otherwise the machine is less easy to control. Following this process, we then need to leave the floor to dry for a minimum of 12 hours. And this would be under normal room conditions, so 20 degrees, 50% humidity. If it's particularly cold on site, it's going to retard the drying time, which we need to be very mindful of because, at low temperatures, it will take longer to dry, and we must ensure it's dry before we overcoat it with lacquer if that's our intention. Okay, our surface is all nicely dry now. So we've got the nice dark effect that's come from the brushing and the water popping, and we're going to now apply a second coat of a different colour. So we call this process accent tinting, and of course it allows for a lot of creative freedom. So we have currently 17 colours of the Craft Oil 2K, but obviously if we're mixing and matching them like this, there's a massive range available. But what we'll notice from this is the very specific look that this process provides. So I'm just going to quickly mix this up and apply this in exactly the same way as before. And you can see that we've now produced a very different effect with the floor. We've got that slight texture from the fibre pads that have given us that slight brushing to the wood, which has allowed us to really get the ash coloured Craft Oil 2K to emphasise the grain pattern with that nice rich underlying brown colour. So we now have to leave this for 12 hours minimum before we then overcoat it with the Traffic HD. Okay, our second coat of Craft Oil 2K, the Craft Oil 2K Ash, is now completely dry. It's had at least 12 hours to dry. It's always a good idea though, before attempting the next stage, which is lacquer application. This is done in order to render the surface more durable and really to protect the treatment as well. As you can imagine, when you go for these more involved looks with the floor, it's going to be less easy to perform any repairs if we're just dealing with the oiled surface. So it's far better in many environments, like I say, in kitchen environments or higher traffic environments, that we overcoat it with either Traffic HD or Traffic Natural. It's important that it's one of our two-component products because that works tremendously well with the two-component oil. It's a really compatible system. So the first thing that I'd want to check is that that coat is dry. So I've just got a clean piece of paper. We just rub that on the surface, and what we're looking for is it to be completely clean like this. So we know that it's dry. We've removed all of the excess material, and like I say, it's just simply left now to overcoat with the Traffic HD. Obviously, got 5 litres of the Traffic here, enough to do a single coat on 50 square metres, so we don't need anything like that quantity. So instead I'm just going to quickly mix up a smaller volume just to do this, this panel. Really important information here, before we decant smaller volumes from the main Traffic bottle, we must shake it vigorously. Sometimes matting agents can settle out in the container, and this means if we don't shake the product, the first quantity that I decant off is going to have no matting agents, so it's going to be super shiny. And then when I pour out the second batch, the bottom part of the bottle, in other words, it's going to be very, very matte indeed. So like I say, really important that we shake the main Traffic bottle before decanting from it. So I'm going to mix up about 1 litre. With this mixing bottle, we've got clear graduations on the side, which enables us to gauge the quantity of product and then add the correct amount of hardener. And let's just top this up to the second mark on the container, and we're there. I imagine many people have used the Traffic product before, but just for those that haven't, it's really important that we shake the hardener into the Traffic HD. We can't just stir it in a paint tray with a stick or something. It has to be shaken. It's the only effective way of mixing the two components. In terms of application today, we're going to be using the medium pile roller. That's the Bona polyester roller. And this makes the process very simple. So I can start the application now. I'm going to pour the product directly onto the floor, and the reason I'm able to do this is that I don't have any gaps in the flooring. It's completely sealed, if you like, so we're safe pouring the product directly on. If it was a different situation, I might pour the product into one of the Bona boxes with a plastic bag and use that as a paint tray. So there's a bit more control like that. But in this instance, I'm safe to pour it on. Of course, we're lucky in this sense, we don't have any edges to do, which we would normally do with the brush. So I can just go straight on with the roller. First part of the application that's important is to get the roller fully loaded with product. This will help us get the correct coverage rate of 8 to 10 square meters per litre. So you can see that all of that product that I've poured out is pretty much held in the roller. So I'll pour a small amount more. And this is the standard roller application that we would advocate, whereby we're going across the floor in 2 directions. And there's a good reason for this, because although in here we've got very good light, when you're working in poor light conditions, it can be quite easy to miss a small area. But if we're going over in 2 directions, that's not possible. So I've just roughly distributed the product out, and now I'm going to even it out. I'm not putting any downward weight on the roller, just letting it work under its own steam. What's quite interesting is at the moment, because the product's wet, it's quite shiny. And this is really showing off that subtle texture that we introduced with the fibre pad. The version of Traffic HD I'm using is in fact the extra matte. So when it's dry, it's going to be very flat, and it's not going to differ much from the simple oil treatment that we've had. But of course with the Traffic, we'll have a really resistant wear coat on top of the treatment, which will protect it. And then it's just a question of maintaining that wear layer with the correct cleaning, and we can overcoat at intervals in the future before the wear has progressed too far. Of course, in doing this, we should be able to avoid ever having to sand the floor heavily again. And the final last bit. So a typical treatment schedule would be the craft oil, and as we've seen, we can use it as a single application, or we can do the accent tinting like we've done here with a second application, and then we would overcoat that with 2 coats of Traffic HD or Traffic Natural. Of course, in some environments, particularly more challenging ones, we can either increase the number of coats for the initial application, or, as I mentioned, at later intervals, we can just give the surface a clean, a light sand, and apply additional coats before it's too worn. So now we'll leave this to dry, take about 2.5 hours, and then we'll apply a second coat. And there we have it.